Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's just 5 o'clock, so I'm going to give everyone at least one more minute to join. But this is the Making Housing Attainable in Southern Maine, exploring successes and barriers to housing development. We have a really good group of folks with us tonight with different backgrounds to discuss housing issues in the region. And we're really excited to have a conversation with them and then have some Q&A at the end. If you could go to the agenda, please. We have a pretty packed evening, but we're just going to do a quick welcome, which is what this is. Michaela will introduce the joint land use study for everybody, and then I'll talk about the specific housing work or task for the JLUS grant. And then at 5:15-ish, we'll jump right into the panel discussion. At 6:30, we'll do question and answers with the panelists. And for that, there are two ways to interact. The first one is use the raise your hand feature in Zoom. You can we'll unmute you and you can ask questions directly as if you're at an in-person meeting. And then the second option is there's a Q&A button or tab, which you can actually type in questions if speaking at the meeting is not what you would like to do. So we'll also go through those at the end as well. So there's two options, and we'll roll with it as we go, starting at 6:30. So with that, I'm just going to introduce myself, Jamel Torres. I work at SMPDC. I'm the Land Use Division Director. And I believe at this point, we're going to turn it over to Michaela to talk about the joint land use study. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks, Jamel. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. See people are slowly trickling in, so I might just talk a little bit longer as we wait for some folks to join. We're really excited to have you all here this evening. We get to hear from four amazing panelists. We also get to learn about the Joint Land Use Study program and how much of an positive impact it's had in our Southern Maine region. So I will just wait another minute and then dive in. All right, now that folks who have joined have gotten a chance to glance at the agenda, let's jump right in. First, I would just like to speak to JLUS. So JLUS is the Joint Land Use Study. It's a program through the Department of Defense, Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation. Has a different name now, but in this region, we've been utilizing this program for several years. So JLUS has just stuck. It's a really great program that enables communities with military installations to access funding and technical assistance for planning and implementation activities. This is our fourth round of JLUS funding. This round started in fall of 2024, and it will continue through the end of this year. It includes several awesome tasks, a parking structure feasibility study, a transportation demand management plan, a survey of shipyard workers, an infrastructure vulnerability assessment, strategic emergency preparedness plan, a funding roadmap, and then a housing task. Tonight we'll be focusing on the housing task. So to set that up, I'll mention that you might hear a lot of different housing terminology tonight. And when we're talking about housing affordability in general, we mean it pretty broadly. We mean the ability for folks to access housing that is within their means. And when we say, capital A, affordable housing or subsidized housing, we're talking about income restricted housing for lower income levels generally. When we're talking about lowercase a affordable housing, we are just talking about naturally occurring affordable housing, meaning it's present in our housing supply and it's not subsidized or income restricted. And then we also might use the terminology workforce housing, and there we're talking about housing that's more targeted towards specific moderate or medium income levels, like for teachers or nurses or firefighters. Um, and all of these different types of housing we're hoping to address with our different panelists. Um, Through this workshop, through the JLUIS effort, we have a JLUIS partnership. And I want to make sure we recognize the town of Kittery and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, our two major partners in this effort, as well as all of the municipalities who are home to lots of shipyard workers throughout southern Maine and New Hampshire. We also have partners from various state of Maine agencies, federal agencies, nonprofits, and private sector folks. And all together, through the JLUIS partnership, we're able to really move the needle on environmental, transportation, and housing planning activities in the southern Maine region in and around the town of Kittery and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Our studies and efforts so far have produced amazing data and recommendations, and each round of funding we've been able to move closer towards implementation and policy making. So with that being said, thank you all for being here. That's a little bit of an overview of JLUIS, and now I'll hand it off to Jamel to talk about the housing task in particular.
Thanks for that intro, Michaela. I'm just going to go through our specific housing work that we're working on through the JLUIS grant. We're actually working with two regional planning organizations across the border in New Hampshire, which is really exciting for us to go across state lines. We don't get to do that very often. So we're working with Stratford Regional Planning Commission and Rockingham Planning Commission, both located just over the southern border in Maine. And throughout the housing work task, we're going to create a regulatory housing toolkit, which will include different ordinances and regulatory tools to help communities increase housing stock in the region through a variety of ways. And another part of that work is public education opportunities, which is this workshop tonight. Tonight, we're going to focus on a variety of issues. And in the fall, we're going to have another virtual webinar really diving into the items within the housing toolkit for our municipalities to explore and learn more about. We're thinking that will be sometime between September and November. We wanted to let summer occur and let folks have their summertime activities before we had a evening workshop. So we'll reconvene in the fall for another one. That's a quick overview of the housing task, pretty high level, but we really want to get into the panel. That's the meat of this evening. So I'm going to stop talking about the housing task and the things that we're doing there. So I think at this point, I'll turn it back to Michaela to kick us off with the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamel. So now I'd love each panelist to introduce themselves, where they're coming from, their work experience in municipal housing regulation from whatever perspective, whether that's through municipal lens, the private sector lens, the nonprofit lens, or otherwise. And we'll start with Patrick, and then we'll go to Emmy, then Brooks, then Julie.
Hey, thanks, Michaela. Good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Hess, Director of Real Estate Development at Avesta Housing. We're a nonprofit affordable housing development and management organization based in Portland. We recently celebrated our 50th anniversary. We've been working throughout southern Maine and parts of New Hampshire on the development and rehab and management of affordable housing. We have just over 100 properties, just over 3,000 apartments that we manage. And I come at this from originally an urban planning background. So, like some others, I'm a recovering planner and excited to be talking with everyone today about the J-Luce region and what we can do to facilitate more housing, more much needed housing.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for SMPDC for having me tonight. I'm representing south of the border, New Hampshire, the Granite State, but some of you might recognize me from my role with the Greater Portland Council of Governments just before I assumed this position. So I do see some familiar names, which is good. Good to see you all. As I said, I'm the relatively new executive director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. And we were actually founded way back in 2001 when employers in the region began getting a little concerned about where their employees were going to live. Much like Portland, the Seacoast economy is really driven by tourism. Tourism is driven by service jobs, and as we remind people all the time in this work, housing is where jobs go to sleep. So that's how we were created. We originally began as a program of the Housing Partnership and then later established as a 501c3 nonprofit organization in 2009. And then a year later, we hosted our first design charrette program in Hampton Falls, which was actually later developed by Avesta Housing and is now affordable senior housing. And whose residents I actually supported when I worked for Avesta Housing Property Management back in the day. So another reminder of how small our housing world really is here in New England. But since then, our design charrette program has really become a staple of ours, and we're always looking for new opportunities to get housing projects off on the right foot. So if you have any questions, if there are any developers on the call, don't hesitate to reach out, and we'd be happy to help. We do a slew of other programming that I'd be happy to talk about throughout the conversation. But one thing that I can point to now is our spring policy session will be held on June 24th. And that's down here in Portsmouth. If any of you are interested, I can definitely get a registration link over to you. So anyway, long-winded way of introducing myself, but it's good to be here. Good to see you all.
Good evening. I'm Brooks Moore. I'm the Director of Development for the South Portland Housing Authority. The Housing Authority is a public housing authority. So it's initially founded to house Liberty Shipyard workers for the war effort. So kind of similar to what's going on in Kittery. We have public housing that was financed pre-1980s directly by HUD. And then since the IRS tax credit program came in the 80s, we have a nonprofit development arm that we do our current development under. So we have sort of legacy HUD properties, and then we have tax credit properties as well. We primarily develop in South Portland. We work closely with the municipality. We've also recently done several developments in Scarborough, and we've acted as a development consultant for Biddeford Housing as well. Like Patrick, I'm also a former planner. with the city of Westbrook and then the town of Wyndham. So kind of an urban community and then a little bit more suburban. And I worked for Vesta Housing for 3 years prior to going over to Southport. So I'll turn over to Julie.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Brooke. Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Curran. I'm here with Great Falls Construction. You're probably wondering what a construction company is doing on this call, so I'll explain. I have two hats to wear. One is that we do commercial construction for clients, and that entails a lot of different projects all throughout northern New England. And so we do build a lot of housing projects for clients. But tonight I'm here with my hat as a developer, and we also have it's somewhat quiet development portfolio of our own of a lot of mixed use properties, housing being a big part of that, generally located in village centers. And I appreciate SMPDC for having me this evening. I look forward to sort of speaking with the hat of being sort of a for-profit developer and what that's like. And I think what I'll talk about a lot tonight is a project we're working on in Berwick that SMPDC is very involved with as well, the former prime tanning facility. So I look forward to getting into that. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you all. And now we'll turn into the meat of the panel and start asking some questions. So the first question is, could each of you please provide an example of an exciting or interesting housing project that your organization has been involved with recently? Julie, how about we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Well, that's great. I'll talk about Berwick. So the project in Berwick is a former prime tanning project, and it's in the J. Lewis region, which is why I'll highlight this one. It's about an 8-acre site. It's a brownfield site, and so we are currently in the midst of phase 2 of the project. And when it's fully built out, it'll be 265 residential units and somewhere around 30 commercial units. And so we are chugging right along. We just finished our 5th building there. And so things are moving right along. So I think that's an exciting project for us. We really keep telling ourselves, like, when do you get to rebuild a village center? Because really, if you're familiar with Berwick, this property is right near Town Hall and sort of in the center of the town. And I think one of the highlights, just to sort of bring it back, we worked a lot with the municipality, on how to sort of make this project work. We worked a lot with SMPDC, who's been a critical partner here as well. And I think one of the interesting and exciting things about this is that it's there was a lot of momentum around the project from the municipality side. They did a lot of work before we even came on the scene. And quite frankly, we wouldn't have came on the scene if this work didn't happen. They did a lot of work on the brownfield conditions of the site to get it to a point at which it made sense to pursue as a development project. So I give a lot of props to the town of Berwick and their partners in that, of which I know SMPDC was one, and many others as well. So it's an exciting project because it's taking what once was sort of an economic vibrant center for Berwick and has since been dormant for quite some time, and re-envisioning it into their sort of the village center. So we kept one of the buildings on site. The rest of them many of them were demolished during the town's sort of involvement of the cleanup of the project. And then a few more were demolished once we took ownership. And so if you ever get the chance to drive through Berwick, I hope that you stop in. So I hope that answered the questions, Michaela. Did I did it okay?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. I
Thank
think
you.
that's a great example and really relevant to the folks who are attending. Emmy, let's turn to you.
Sure. Yeah, it's really great to hear about projects just on the road from where we are. I'll just say first and foremost, the Southern Maine and the seacoast economies and workforce are so interconnected. So we love to see new housing in Southern Maine and the Berwicks in York and Kittery. So it's really exciting to hear about those projects. We top of mind for us is Service Credit Union's workforce housing project in Portsmouth, which we actually conducted a design charrette for last June. the designs were actually presented a couple weeks ago at a community meeting, which really is a great model for community engagement for all developers. They're really going the extra mile and making sure the abutters and other members of the community know what's going on. And so it's been a really great process to be a part of. The site is about 25 acres with pretty significant road frontage and is located right behind Service Credit Union's corporate headquarters on Lafayette Road in Portsmouth. And out of those 25 acres, there are approximately 10 acres of wetland and 12 acres of buildable land. And this is, again, right behind their 5-story corporate headquarters in Portsmouth. And the plan is to build a mixed-use development with roughly 240 housing units, and just under 85% of those will be workforce housing. New Hampshire has a legal definition of workforce housing, which means that it's affordable to somebody earning 60% of the area median income in the region. So I think that's, unless I'm mistaken, I think that's unique to New Hampshire. So we define both affordable, deeply affordable, and workforce housing when it comes to the makeup of these new developments. And so with this project, the first phase will include 140 workforce apartments, and later phases will potentially be adding townhouses, potentially veteran housing, and a child care center. So this is a really exciting project for us. It's going to serve so many different members of the workforce. It's going to benefit employers. And just make it a better place to live, work, and play. So we're really excited about that particular project.
That's great. Thanks, Emmy. Patrick?
Sure. Those are tough projects to follow. I don't know that I have anything quite as exciting. We have a few projects at Avesta in various stages of either pre-development or pre-construction about to start in Biddeford, Sanford, and Kittery. But I wanted to highlight a project in Kennebunk, which is, I know, just outside of the J. study area, the approximate. And it's in partnership with Kennebunk Savings Bank, which is for us a really novel and exciting new development in our engagement with the business community. The bank recognized the need for housing in Kennebunk and that they had an opportunity to contribute directly through land that they owned adjacent to their headquarters, similar to the credit union's efforts in Portsmouth. And they selected Avesta to partner with them on the development of housing behind their headquarters. And so we had a really robust process with the community, the town of Kennebunk, to undergo a zone change from industrial to residential to facilitate the development of the housing. And there were many conversations around the community in the run up to the town-wide vote that happened in March of 2024 to ultimately approve that change of zone. And, Avesta and the bank and town staff were out at the Rotary, out at Bean Suppers, out in the grocery store handing out flyers. It was a all hands on deck effort, and the bank and themselves, including up through to their president, were very present leading that effort, which was really exciting because oftentimes we have conversations like this, and whether it's business leaders or elected officials say that is a problem we need to solve, and then they wait around for someone to do something about it. And in this instance, the Kennebunk Savings Bank identified a need, identified a potential way to contribute to that need, and then acted on it in a really dynamic way. And we're excited about the eventual construction of that housing and provision of new homes in Kennebunk. So I know that's a little bit outside of the J. study area, but I think it highlights the potential of new partners that have historically not necessarily played a very active role in housing policy and housing development. And it's certainly very similar, again, to what Service Credit Union is doing in Portsmouth, where we need everybody involved in whatever ways they're able to in order to address this crisis.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. And Brooks, we'll turn to you now.
Yeah, we had a project, it's been completed for 3 years now, I believe, and it's in South Portland. It's on the Route 1 corridor in an area of town called Thornton Heights. It was, at the time we purchased the property, it was an old church that had been abandoned and deconsecrated by the parish. And so it was a very large brick church, a parishioner, the priest's house, and then they had a church school building on the back half. So it was about a 2 acre property, right on Route 1, but also on 3 sides of it was a single family neighborhood. So the building and the site had become really dilapidated. There was drug use going on, prostitution. So it was really kind of dragging down the neighborhood. At the same time, the city, through some stormwater work, had done a lot of streetscape improvements along that corridor of Route 1, flags, new light poles, wider sidewalks. So they had sort of primed the area for redevelopment, and we're looking for catalysts. So we purchased the property from Dunkin' Donuts that had tried to go in previously and had gotten shut down by the neighborhood. Because it was surrounded on 3 sides by a single family neighborhood, we knew that it was likely to be a contentious project. So we held 3 neighborhood meetings to start the process. We went in just to introduce ourselves, not even show any designs, and kind of asked the neighbor what they wanted. We then progressed from there, doing design iterations and going back to the neighborhood several times. Even with that process, we still faced very stiff opposition from, I would say, a majority of the neighborhood, but at the same time, we had some support as well. So with that, we then had to go to the city council, and we had to get a supermajority vote for a contract zone. So we needed 5 of 7 councilors. That came down to lobbying individual councilors, and we ultimately had a second reading before the council where 100 people showed up to speak for and against. And through a lot of effort, it was about 50-50 for and against. And we got the final, we passed by 1 vote. So it was touch and go. We then went through the whole process of obtaining funding. Like Julie's project, we got a EPA, or I'm assuming what they got. We got an EPA Region 1 Brownfields grant. That was worth 500,000, I believe. We also got 300,000 from the CDBG program. That enabled us to take down the church and the other buildings and prep the site. We then were able to get a tax credit financing. So the building ended up with 52 apartments. 20% were for those at 30% area median income or less. We then had a middle band that was for 50 and 60% area median income, and then with the final 20% was market rate. So mix of housing. We had to obtain a lot of funding sources. And we also, because of the zoning and to make it a real community benefit, we condoed the building, and we put in ground floor retail space along Route 1, also called Main Street. So the building is completed, fully occupied, but I will say that the construction started during the pandemic, and the retail aspect has been the most challenging. We've got 2 of the 3 spaces filled, and that third space is proving the most difficult. I would just additionally add the building is non-age restricted housing. So not 55 and older. And that getting that kind of housing or non-age restricted housing permit is really a big challenge these days. So anyway, it's a great building. It took about 5 years from when we first had our first neighborhood meeting to it being completed. So these projects take a long time. You're asking for public approvals, public financing, so there's a lot of hoops to jump through, a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And so I'd say if you're in a municipality and you're looking at one of these projects, know that it's a long-term endeavor, a long-term partnership.
I just wanted to jump in quick. We did get a question from our Q&A. We have a question for Patrick about the bank and whether the bank, I think the bank employees would have priority access to the housing units. If you
That's a
want to
great
talk about
question.
that.
On this development, no. This will be developed with the low-income housing tax credit, a federal resource that's allocated through the state, which has pretty significant income and rental restrictions that are placed on it, and also requires compliance with fair housing laws, which prohibit us from dedicating certain units to employees of a particular employer. So we have seen that type of development in other parts of the country. I'm not familiar with any that are happening in our region. It's something that Avesta is definitely open to talking about, finding additional models to develop much needed, especially workforce housing outside of federal programs like the one I described. But that is not a component of the project in Kennebunk that I described.
Thanks for answering that question kind of on the fly. I think we're gonna utilize that if they're like relevant to this specific question. So we appreciate you answering that. We're gonna jump into question number 2. And the question is, in your opinion, what are some barriers to housing production at the local level? And how can these barriers be addressed? And I think for this one, we'll start with Patrick.
Yes, great. Thank you. I think, big barriers are certainly adequate zoning, like I described in the Kennebuck example. There was a parcel of land that I don't know if it had ever been used for industrial, and the likelihood of it being used for that, I think, were very slim. And the kind of public priority there was certainly for housing. It was an extra step. As Brooks described with his project example, these things can take a lot of time, but if the zoning is there, then it makes it a lot more streamlined. So that's a fairly obvious one. Provision of infrastructure is a really critical component of our evaluation of site suitability. Whether it has public water, sufficient electric power, sewer is not required in our developments, but is certainly much preferred to septic. And that's something that I know a lot of municipalities are looking at and have been doing over the years, is directing capital dollars to facilitate development in additional areas. Avesta partnered with the city of South Portland actually on a project not too far from the one Brooks described a few years ago, where the city did infrastructure improvements in order to facilitate the development. So those are not, they're both opportunities and barriers. I would say another barrier that we've seen is not a structural one, but more of an ad hoc barrier, which is a misalignment between various stakeholders within municipal government and boards, where maybe the planning board has certain priorities, staff have certain priorities, other non-planning elements of municipal government have their own priorities, whether it's fire, public works, code. And the more that communities can seek alignment on particular issues or particular site proposals that come before them, then the smoother the process can go, and the faster the housing can be provided. Unfortunately, we've seen a number of examples where planning board was in favor of something, planning staff were in favor of something, but other members of municipal government got involved and either significantly curtailed the development, or in some cases may have shunted it off entirely because of a different misaligned set of priorities.
Thank you. We'll jump to Emmy. Let me know if you want me to repeat the question.
Oh, that's okay. I was gonna talk. I feel bad for whoever answers this last because I think we might have very similar ideas, but I just want to jump off what Patrick just suggested as a barrier and actually offer a solution, which we're seeing a lot of success with. And that's housing task forces and housing committees. They're not only kind of focusing in on particular issues, but they are talking to planning boards, they're talking to city councils, they're gauging that consensus or lack of consensus all along the way in their processes. And so we've seen a lot of really excellent outcomes, particularly in communities that we never thought would move, on some of these issues here in New Hampshire. So that is a great solution. Um, I think another big barrier is resistance to change. We talk about it all the time. Community engagement is, continuous community engagement, not just when there's a project sort of in front of folks to look at, but to really gauge, how people are feeling, what they're thinking, and to bring people to the table who normally don't have a seat at the table. I think that's a really important thing to remember is that the stakeholders involved aren't only the abutters, but the prospective residents of the properties that we are considering putting in our communities. So working with organizations that work with those communities on a daily basis has been a really effective way to make sure that they're involved in the conversations. And then obviously funding is the one of the biggest and ever growing barriers right now for affordable workforce and supportive housing, all housing types really. But so local affordable housing funds, there are many, that I know exist in Maine. I think one in, Scarborough, and the New Hampshire Seacoast, and they're really becoming of even greater importance these days as those local trust funds. So
Thanks, Emmy. I do have a follow-up question, and I was wondering, in your experience, like who typically sits on these municipal or community housing committees?
yeah, it's a good question. So there's committees, task forces, and commissions, and they're all slightly different in their composition and in terms of their power. So it depends which one you're trying to set up and for what purpose. But generally speaking, it's people who live in the community. There's just the same criteria as the planning board in some cases. But people who live and work and play in the community and really have a sort of daily experience of what it's like to live there. And some of them have really deep expertise, some of them don't. Some of them are learning along the way and are still just as valuable in those conversations.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Thanks for mentioning those committees and trusts. We'll move on to Brooks for some barriers to housing production at the local level.
Yeah, I mean, I'd piggyback on what Patrick and Emmy have said. I think the zoning piece in particular, almost all the projects I've done have required a contract zone because the zoning the density is typically not enough, or the setbacks don't allow for a development on a lot, or there's height restrictions that are too restrictive. And so by going for a contract zone, it means you have to go before town council or a city council, or you have to, as Patrick mentioned, you've got to go to a townwide vote, which is even less which is even, I'll say even more difficult to get. So as much as towns can do to look at their growth zones or areas where they've got infrastructure, as Patrick noted, and say, you know, if we wanted a 30 unit or 40 unit building in this area, we're looking at, we've got lots of 1 acre or 3 acres. What kind of density will we need for a 30 unit building or a 40 unit building, or even if you wanted a 12 unit building? But really doing some deep dive in your growth areas or in your town centers, because every time that we have to go to a city council, it's a legislative decision. And so the town has no requirement to adopt it or to pass your project or to approve the zoning you're asking for. Whereas if you've already got that in place and we're going before a planning board, at least we're trying to meet a set of standards that have already been put in place. If we meet those standards, then the project should be approved. If we don't, then it obviously needs to be changed or it's not the right location. But time and time again, there's just so much uncertainty because we're going before town legislators to get a legislative decision. I would say, like, Pat, kind of being more maybe specific with what Patrick was saying, it's on the town staff side, it's really the fire departments I've found the most difficult to work with. So if you're proposing a project, really meet with the fire department early and often. They have their own set of standards and their own fire code. And they also have a trump card where they can sort of make up some arbitrary rules on their own outside of the codes. It's called the authority having jurisdiction. That can be a real challenge as you're going through project design. And then finally, as Emmy was saying, there's no funding out there right now for what Michaela was referring to as workforce housing, so that 60% to 120% area median income housing. We just proposed 36 units of workforce housing in Scarborough, which we're going to do in modular townhouses. You can look in the Press Herald, it got denied by the town council last week. But that project had a $2 million funding gap that we as the housing authority were going to close with our own funding. So it's big gaps in the financing for that kind of development and to reach that what we've been referred to as a missing middle. In that case, we were going to bring our own funding and invest in Scarborough, and so now we're not. Anyway, so that's what I see on our end.
Thank you, Brooks. And Julie.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'll just put an exclamation point on what everyone's already said. I think a couple of the items that I would just underline would be height restrictions. If we want more density, we have to allow for taller buildings. We're running out of land. So that's a real consideration. And I think it's something that could be looked at and probably should, especially in urban centers. And I would just say parking standards follow suit on that. For obvious reasons. I do think one of the things, and I sort of alluded to this earlier in my remarks, was around, I make a joke, find me a site in an urban center that isn't an urban fill site or a brownfield or has some designation from an environmental perspective. We've worked with municipalities, I mentioned Berwick, Windham, Auburn, that have really dove in on these city-owned properties and remediated the condition that was on that each respective site. And, they are subject to grant money, whereas if we were to procure it, we would not be subject to that, and there'd be some liability in that as well. So that's been really effective in attracting us to those specific municipalities. It's been really collaborative. So I think a barrier could be environmental contaminants, but I think to spin it positively, there's some tools in the toolbox out there that those specific municipalities that we worked with have really leveraged and made it an attractive place to be. And I think timelines, we don't have the same sort of subsidy funding timelines that others might, but we certainly, we want to move and we want to move fast. We're all expending a lot of funds early on to design these projects. And so when it gets caught up in municipal and permitting processes, it really does affect the bottom line. With both my construction and my developer hat on, I'll say Maine in the winter, not ideal to start a project. And so we're all I think everyone on the call can agree. We're all thinking about the snow flying now. And so I think that's an important factor in approval processes. And so when we miss those deadlines because of processes taking too long, it's a real bummer for everyone's sort of pro formas and the project just takes a lot longer. The last thing I'll say as a barrier, it is sort of, and I think that there's the work happening in the legislature to sort of help level this out. But we enter processes as developers, we all do, and sort of there's a lot that goes into that, a lot of capital stack work, a lot of pro forma work, and when we enter into those processes, I think that the expectation and the hope is that that what's in place at that time is applicable. I think some of our experience has been the rules of engagement tend to change as the project evolves. And I think as developers, we all sort of do our due diligence really early on in the process to make sure a project is viable and can work. And if those rules of engagement change along the way, it really does affect what the outcome can and will be. And like I mentioned, there's a lot of effort and money and time caught up in the design process. And so I think just having open and honest communications, if there are things like impact fees down the line or permit fees that you're looking at adjusting, having those conversations with your development community is really imperative early on because no one likes to be surprised. And I think it does really affect all of our projects, or I guess I'll speak for myself, all of our projects when that happens. So I think those are the highlights. Thanks.
Thank you all. It's really interesting to hear that perspective from, the development and nonprofit side. And it sounds to me like predictability is a huge thing. So it's interesting to hear your responses to that question. So thank you. The next question is about partnerships, and you've all already mentioned when you talked about your examples of recent successful projects, partnerships. So I'd love for you to speak more to how your organization has partnered with a local government to lead to new homes in that community. Do you want to expand upon the examples you gave already and get into the specifics of what that partnership looked like, who initiated the conversations, who among the town were you consistently talking to, and kind of what that looked like so that any municipal folks who are participating can understand how they might be able to, start initiating those sorts of positive relationships with folks like you guys. So let's start with Brooks.
So I mentioned barriers, but also in overcoming those barriers, we wouldn't have been able to do it without town staff. We also work with Cumberland County and other organizations. So, when we're going through these zoning requests, if it wasn't for town support and ultimately town approval, the projects wouldn't happen. In some towns, we've received some help with the financing. So typically the tax credits can cover anywhere from 30 to 60% of the costs. We then have to make up that remainder of the funding from the various funding sources. For example, the town of Scarborough, as Emmy mentioned, has money set aside from subdivision applications that go into an affordable housing fund. So it's not taxpayer funds, but it's fees collected. So for example, there in Scarborough, it's up to $200,000 seed money that can help with the pre-development costs. In a project I helped Biddeford Housing with, the town the city came forward with $400,000 in funding that without the project wouldn't have moved forward. And I think as Patrick can attest to, on all of the tax credit properties we do, we have to get tax increment financing from the municipality. So that's a reduction in the property taxes. By getting that reduction in the property taxes, we can afford to pay more debt on the projects. So we get tax credits on the projects. We also get debt, and the rents go to pay the debt. By having that lower tax burden, we can pay more debt, and it fills more of the cost of construction. Maine Housing pretty much requires it both in their funding formulas and also in their scoring. So they score all the projects that come to them against each other. If the town isn't supporting you with a TIF or tax increment financing, it's extremely, at least in Maine, I would say almost impossible to get the project to fruition. So definitely a partnership with various levels of government.
Thanks, Brooks. Could others also speak to the partnership question? How about Patrick?
Sure. I have an example of a great partnership with the community of Scarborough, where another tool that municipalities are and should continue considering leveraging to facilitate housing development is the land that they own. So the town of Scarborough had an aging public safety complex that they were in the midst of replacing, and they decided that the best reuse of that old facility was for housing and other uses. And so they issued a request for proposals, which Avesta, in partnership with others, secured to develop what is now called Firehouse Village, which is a mixed-use campus right off of Route 1. It includes office, retail, a couple of different storefronts, a nice restaurant, fish store, and senior housing at the back of the lot, all on the same parcel. And so that was partnership with the town of Scarborough, who had the vision for the adaptive reuse of the site. They issued the RFP. They supported our development of affordable housing with funds from their Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which Brooks mentioned earlier and Emmy highlighted as well. And then the staff themselves, from the town manager on down, were really instrumental in getting the project through the approvals process and then under construction until it's now completed. And we were happy to open it up last year. And so there's another tool that I would say, again, a lot of municipalities are using and should continue to use, which is to scan their own real estate holdings to figure out if there are properties that are no longer serving the intended purpose or maybe outside of their useful life and could be offered up for redevelopment into housing of whatever type, whether it's affordable, workforce, or some other combination. It's an important tool in the stack for sure.
Great, thanks, Patrick. And Brooks, we'll actually go back to you really quickly. We have a question about the use of tax increment financing in closing the financing gap on projects. So if you could speak to that a little bit, that would be great.
I'm not sure exactly what to add. I guess I would say that we have to go to so I guess I'll start with Maine Housing. They fund most of our projects using the tax credit program, and they provide subsidy and they provide debt. So to get the tax credits, they do a competitive scoring round every fall, and typically they'll get upwards of 15 applications and they'll fund 5. So it's very competitive. They give points in their scoring matrix for projects that have a TIF in hand. So it's like, and it's a varying, levels. So you'll get 5 points if you have a 75% reduction in your taxes over 30 years. And then if you got a 50% reduction over 15 years, you might get 2 points. So all of us, because you have to maximize your points because it's so competitive, we're all having to ask for 75% tax increment financing over 30 years. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other is that Maine Housing is providing debt. So on a project, as I mentioned, the tax credits, if it's a 9% competitive project, will cover 60% to 70% of your project costs. The other part is filled with subsidy, and then another part's filled with debt. So we may have debt of $2 million to $3 million on a project, paid off over uh, 30 years. And that without the TIF, we wouldn't be able to afford as much debt as possible. And so we'd have to raise even more of the gap financing, which is our own funds or Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston funds, or it could be CDBG funds, various other funding sources. So the TIF, we go to the town, we talk to the staff, request the TIF, show them. Oftentimes I've gone to the town with our financial model to show them the actual numbers and why it's in addition to the scoring criteria for Maine Housing, the financial need for the TIF. And I've sat down with town staff and town councilors to do that. And then ultimately it's a town council vote. In general, the towns have been supportive because they're supportive of the towns we've worked in are supportive of affordable housing. And also, as part of the TIF process, they are able to shelter that value from their school funding formula. So it does provide them some additional benefit as well. If they're a town that gets, if they're typically a high assessed value town, they get less school funding. And so by using TIFs, they're able to shelter some of that value and get more school funding. So ultimately we need a town council vote. I will say in some communities we've kind of become the target of anti-tax groups who feel like we're getting a handout and don't recognize the investment that we're bringing in. So we do deal with that in some communities. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Brooks. I find that really helpful. And now I'll go to Emmy back to the question about partnership and how that's looked like for your organization.
Sure. Yeah, we work with municipalities all the time, particularly when it comes to our Design Charrette program. And that might be because a municipality has some town or city-owned land that they'd like to develop on, or they're struggling with a rezoning issue. And a great example of that is we actually did a design charrette for the town of Kittery last year, where we looked at the what's currently zoned as the business park zone, and that has actually gone back and forth between commercial, industrial, and zoned for multifamily residential a number of times, and so the town is just quite frankly confused about what to do with this particular area of land, because some of the plans say that residents want housing, and in some cases there have been some contradictory decisions. So it's currently zoned as for commercial and industrial. And the purpose of this design charrette was to really kind of dig in and say, okay, what is possible here? What could be possible for housing? What housing type? Really getting into the meat and potatoes of what aesthetically abutters and members of the community might like to see there in terms of housing. Is it possible to both rezone that for multifamily housing and then to actually build that missing middle housing in that zone? So that's a great example of a community in the J-Luce area that we've worked with, and we've worked with a number of other uh, municipalities along the way who are really just, grappling with certain, whether it's a site specific issue or a zoning issue. We come in as that third party facilitator for municipalities all the time.
Awesome, thank you. And Jamel and I had the pleasure of attending that charrette in Kittery, so it was a really great opportunity. Julie, what about your thoughts on partnership?
Yeah, I think it takes a team. So absolutely, we've worked with a lot of local municipalities to sort of make it happen. I think that I think Patrick mentioned sort of assessing like city-owned property, and so we have from that regard been respondents to quite a few RFPs throughout Southern Maine, some successful, some not. And I think one that I'll highlight, which just happened, we're in the midst of the public process right now, planning in Wyndham. We partnered with Westbrook Housing, Westbrook Development Corporation on a city-owned property. It was a former school property, and we're doing a joint development there with a mix of housing options. And so it's an interesting and sort of creative project, and the town of Wyndham has been really collaborative, and their RFP they issued asked for I think it was a while ago, but I think it was 51% of affordable, and that they would like workforce and some market rate as well. So we're working with the municipality now on sort of what the workforce might look like, what a TIF can do to offset that. We've talked about TIFs quite a bit, but in my world as well, TIFs are imperative to the capital stack and the success of a project. There's gaps on the private side as well, specifically in this market with these interest rates and what we're experiencing. It makes it more difficult to pencil projects than ever. And so I think looking at sort of what are creative solutions to help offset that from the municipal's perspective, and TIFs are certainly that for many projects. So that's one example in Wyndham. We worked with Auburn as well. I know that's well out of the J-Luce region. Berwick, I mentioned earlier. So I think in some of the TIF structures, some of the interesting ones we've seen from my perspective, which we don't work with Maine Housing on funding, so there's a bit more flexibility. I think from the municipality side, a bit more negotiation that happens, and so I've seen some that have been really front loaded to incentivize us to move fast, and so like the first half of the TIF, the percentage is higher, and then it levels out at the second half. We've seen that. We've seen, we also, Brooks mentioned this, going to the municipality with your financial models and your pro formas, and sort of having the discussion to say, this is the gap on the project. Is it feasible to discuss what a TIF might look like, and in order to get us through the early days of the operation of the project. And so it's always been a discussion, and it sort of goes back to my initial comment on this question, which it takes a team. And so we've had a lot of really good discussion and creative solutions working with local governments.
It also sounds like there's trust there. So I wonder if you could speak to that briefly, because for you to come in and show your pro forma, and others said that as well, that takes trust, and then the ability to, go back and forth with the municipality and find that mutually beneficial solution, I would think takes a lot of trust. So could you just speak to that for a moment?
Sure. Yeah, it's a good question. I think, like, just as humans, we like to go where we're celebrated. And I think that you as developers, you sort of, you know where that is, and you can sense that early on in the process. if folks really want, are really behind the idea of wanting development in an area, there's an energy around that really it does sort of ripple throughout the municipality. So that seems probably like a soft answer to a hard question, but that is sort of first and foremost. And we have a vested interest in our development portfolio is really village center, like I mentioned earlier, based. And so if there are municipalities like sort of wondering what we do with these village centers or issuing RFPs for city-owned properties in those areas, we're looking at them and having early conversations and sort of discussing what is your vision here? Like, are we a good fit? Sometimes we're not, and that's all good too. So there's just a lot of discussion and relationship building in those early days from both sides, because we want to make sure that we're the right fit for them and they're the right fit for us. And so I think it takes a lot of discussion. But I would say on the whole, everyone working at municipalities, they really want good things to happen in their communities. And so I think that's tried and true in my experience. And so I think that getting those discussions going and going early make a lot of sense. So yeah, I hope that answered the question. But I think trust is something that we all build, and it's a small community here in Maine, and so just sort of working together to try to get to the common goal, which is build more housing, appropriate housing in the appropriate places, in order to meet the demands that we all have in our communities for our neighbors.
Thanks. That was really interesting round of questions. I think everybody had like a different angle or topic. And we're going to continue on with this partnership with towns or communities. And the question is related to that. Other than TIFs, or we can keep exploring TIFs, but are there any other specific policy or regulatory tools that have been helpful for you all and your organizations in creating new homes? And I think for this one, we'll start with Brooks. You're on mute, Brooks.
Yeah. I feel like I've talked about most of the sort of framework that really helps us have projects that are by right, or ones that where we go to the planning board and so we go to the council. Certain towns have funding that can help with pre-development costs. I would say, like, just one kind of quick plug, and that's what I'm seeing with a lot of municipalities is open arms, if you will, for age-restricted housing of 55 and older, but opposition or more difficulty permitting non-age restricted housing, because there's always this concern that we're going to overload the school districts and then the taxes are going to go crazy. And I really feel like from a sort of a societal perspective, it's really short-sighted. It's sort of like kids are become bad. And in the projects we do, yes, there are some kids, but there's always a mix of housing unit types. So there's like 1-unit apartments to 3-unit to 4-unit. Sure, in the 3 and 4-unit, we'll likely have a few kids, but it's not like it's going to be a whole building full of children that are going to overload a school. And there are also going to be kids in at various ages. So there'll be some in elementary, some in middle, some in high school. So I just kind of throw this out there. If they're municipal officials, it would be nice to see more, more sort of acceptance and encouragement of non-age restricted housing. So beyond that, with that, I kind of want to punt it to Patrick, because I've seen how they're doing some projects in Portland where the city has required a certain number of affordable units. So they're doing a 200-unit building in combination with a private developer he could speak about.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of talking about that, but that is certainly a tool that municipalities can evaluate. It's often called inclusionary zoning, where a certain number of affordable units are required in order to get approved or in order to access additional density. And it can be very useful, but it is also difficult to calibrate correctly because, on the one hand, if you make the requirement too onerous, you risk chilling development entirely, which is probably what's been happening in Portland recently as the requirement has been bumped up to 25%. And in other communities, if you put it too low, then maybe you're not achieving the public policy outcomes that you're interested in of ensuring the creation of more affordable housing. So that's something to consider, but I would say do so carefully and definitely in consultation with folks like SMPDC who have a deeper bench of expertise in evaluating this in multiple communities where it's been used before. We've also seen in Portland and in other communities another set of tools that I was going to mention, which is process improvements. So I often think of questions like this is what is it that a municipality can control? Now, obviously, construction costs, interest rates, availability of capital at the scale needed for these developments are almost always outside of the control of a municipality. However, many of the things we've touched on so far are squarely within the ability of a municipality to control or at least influence TIFs, zoning, infrastructure spending. And then another one I was going to mention is processes, right? The City of Portland has done a good job of ensuring some predictability around costs for city services. So plan approvals, building permits get a discounted rate for affordable housing projects. It doesn't necessarily cost the city anything extra, and certainly helps to facilitate much needed housing. That's something I would consider municipality to look at is, Julie was mentioning this earlier, predictability is so critical. And so whether it's a timeline improvement for affordable housing projects, they can cut the line or they can be guaranteed one or two meetings, whatever the necessary amount might be. Permit and impact fees can be lowered if the project meets certain affordability requirements. Those are some tools we've seen in some municipalities, and it would be great if more adopted them as well.
Thank you. And I think Julie has been last for the last two questions. So let's jump to Julie. If you could talk about any regulatory or policy tools that have helped your organization create housing.
Yeah, sure. I don't mind being last, by the way. It's really interesting to hear everyone else's opinion. So thanks. But yeah, so I don't really have much to add here. I think I in my world, it's a little bit, I said like sort of the collaboration with municipality, there's limits to that, right? Like we've got the TIF to discuss. But in my world, like inclusionary zoning would be catastrophic because at the end of the day, we don't get subsidies to offset that from our funding sources. So I think that maybe from my perspective, I see TIFs as being sort of the only tool in the toolbox right now. And I guess I would say like the onerous, sorry, not the onerous, I don't want to use that word. The fees at the onset of a project. None of us get any money in the bank until the project's complete. And in fact, it's like really lopsided at the onset. And so having all these fees due at the beginning of a project can be burdensome for some folks, especially at large scale. And so I think talking about sort of can we come up with having it due at certificate of occupancy when we've had a bit more time to settle into what this looks like, settle into the payments that we have, just being a bit more creative around how sort of we're working together as a team to achieve the same or the end goal that we both want. So I think that there's just there's a lot there, and I'm not coming up with anything substantive, but I think that just creativity and discussion with the development community, I think, is warranted.
Thank you. Anything else to add, Emmy, to the local policy discussion?
Yeah, well, it is really hard being last, Julie, because but Yeah, just I'm glad you brought up inclusionary zoning. We hear that a lot. We hear that a lot in discussions, housing committees and that sort of thing. And, on paper, just as an idea, it makes sense. If you're going to build housing, you want to put as many affordable units in it as possible. But at the same time, it doesn't always pencil out, particularly in communities, more rural communities that just really can't withstand really high inclusionary ordinances. So we saw in Portland, 20% inclusionary ordinance passed. Time is uh, crazy, so I don't know when that was, a couple of years ago, I want to say. But we've seen that it's actually been a little stifling for development. And so I would just say for any community that's even thinking about an inclusionary ordinance or how they might implement something like that, an inclusionary housing study is really a critical first step to that, to see if your market can withstand and to what degree, what percentage it could withstand. Because the goal is to we want to promote and incentivize development and not stifle it. So I would just say that about inclusionary ordinances. And then the other thing that I don't think I heard mentioned was parking requirements. So reducing or eliminating parking requirements near transit or highly walkable areas. This really lowers development costs quite a bit and creates more room for people. And so wherever that's feasible, I always like to remind people that um, eliminating or reducing requirements does not mean that a developer cannot choose to include parking in their site plans if they think it is warranted for the prospective residents that might live there. So that's another good tool in the regulatory toolbox to explore.
Great, thank you all. Moving on to the next question, we want to talk a little bit more about public engagement. So if you could tell us about a recent experience in facilitating a neighborhood meeting or a community workshop related to a proposed housing project, and speak to, how this benefited the community and the project. And I think it would also be really interesting to hear about, who was responsible for the cost of putting on that outreach. Was that on the developer side, on the nonprofit partnership side, or was that on the municipality? How you worked with the municipality to put on that outreach, and any other details you think would be worth sharing. So let's start with Julie this time.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, we conduct neighborhood meetings on all the projects that we do, and our sort of guiding light is early and often. I think my cell phone number is out there for every neighbor on all of our projects, which is great. And I do hear from them, and they have great ideas, and I love engaging with the community on their feedback and working together on a workable solution. So I'll talk. So all of our projects, but I'll highlight in the J. Lewis region the Berwick project. We purchased a property in October 2019. We all know what happened shortly after that, and so we conducted. I think we got in one listening session after we bought it in person, and then things went virtual. So we had a couple listening sessions, which were really just that. We listened. We just let people get up and sort of talk about the property and what their feelings were for the property, what they wanted to see, what they didn't want to see. Like I had said earlier, a lot of public engagement and town efforts towards this property happened well before we were decades before we were involved in it. And so there was a lot of feelings around the site, and it was really important that we heard those and understood those, and we took them to heart. And so we had 2 to 3 listening sessions, and then we switched it to sort of us reporting out on our takeaways and continuing to have dialogue with the public. We did this at town hall when it was in person, and then, like I said, we had to go virtual for a while. And then subsequent to that, I was doing I want to say every quarter an update with Berwick Community TV. They would sort of walk around the site with me, and I would just explain what we were at, what we were doing, and at the end we allowed for sort of any Q&A to come through through the line. And there wasn't a ton of engagement that way, but I think it was, you can look it up on Berwick's website. They're all sort of posted there. And yeah, so that just having continual discussion, and this is a phased project, I should have said at the start. So it's important that I keep that that dialogue going. And so we've just sort of worked on that and own that outside of any required public process. And I can't underscore how important it is to have early and often communications. And we've developed great relationships with the neighbors because we've worked together, and it kind of goes back to the theme we've all been talking about. It just takes a team, and the neighbors and the public are a huge part of that team.
It's a great example. Thanks, Julie. Emmy, how about you?
Yeah, we do facilitate meetings for the community meetings. Not so often for particular projects necessarily, but like I did say at the beginning of the program, we did a follow-up meeting from our design charrette with Service Credit Union to present the designs that actually came from that design charrette process. And so it was really, not only a gesture of goodwill to the community, but it really let them in on the thought process of, here's what we came up with based on your feedback. Here are the constraints that we're working with. Here's what's feasible. Here's what's not. And hence, this is the design that we are at, that we've come up with thus far. So it remains to be seen how it'll benefit the project in the long term, but we had a really productive conversation and a really healthy conversation about those constraints. And there'll always be community members who just plain don't want to see anything happen at a particular site. And we acknowledge them and try to relate to them as best as possible. But in general, I think as Julie said, early and often, they really got way out ahead of the community engagement, and it's really paying off now, and hopefully will continue to pay off for the project to come to fruition.
Thanks, Emmy. Patrick, how about you?
Yeah, I think one other role that I'll highlight that municipalities have played in meetings we've had with communities near our developments or proposed developments has been in helping get the word out. There's a formal process, of course, in I think all communities of noticing residents within a certain distance of a proposed development, which is good and I think serves a key purpose. But what we've found is even more valuable is when municipalities are able to connect us with local stakeholders and leaders that have the networks of folks that we want to make sure are included in the conversation. And sometimes that means sharing emails. Sometimes it means convening pre-meetings with important folks. On top of everything that has already been described by Emmy and Julie, I would just add that we pride ourselves on being good neighbors wherever we have properties around Maine and New Hampshire, and we're operating in over 40 communities, but we're not as local as oftentimes the municipal staff are themselves. And so while we may know some folks, we really are open to suggestion on who else we want to make sure is aware of the meetings and invited personally whenever possible.
Brooks, is there anything you'd like to add about a recent experience facilitating a neighborhood meeting?
Yeah, on the project level, I can talk about the Route 1 Main Street project we did in South Portland. where I'd mentioned there was a single family neighborhood on three sides of a former church campus, which was about a 2 acre site. So when I first started as a planner in Maine for the city of Westbrook, there was a really contentious land use issue where a developer bought a bunch of pre-platted or pre-existing lots and went to develop them. And the neighborhood came out against him, went to the city council. The council put a moratorium on the development of those types of lots and hired a meeting facilitator or kind of a strategic planning facilitator and convened all the neighbors and the developers and the city staff. And when we went into that meeting, into those set of meetings, I remember thinking there's no way there's going to be a resolution to this conflict. The sides are too opposed, it's too contentious, kind of too many insults have been thrown around. And to my surprise, the meeting facilitator was able to, through a series of 4 to 5 meetings, bring the sides together, create meeting environments where people felt like they could express their opinion without getting shouted at or, uh, kind of shouted down. Or you often see in meetings clapping by the sort of the majority or the mob. And by the end of the process, the two sides had come to a negotiated agreement. And it really kind of opened my eyes to the abilities and the potential of using facilitator in contentious land use situations. So when we got to the project where I anticipated there was going to be a lot of neighborhood opposition, we started out with the neighborhood meetings and we hired that same meeting facilitator that I'd used or we had used years ago in the city of Westbrook. And it was not to coerce the neighbors. It wasn't to try to persuade them. It really just was an effort to create a meeting environment around a contentious issue where all parties felt like it was a safe place to express their opinions. And the meeting facilitator did that by running an orderly meeting. And so those who were really opposed to the meeting, opposed to the project, were still opposed by the time the process was done. But I feel like on the flip side, it gave that space for supporters to feel like they could express their support, even in a room full of their neighbors, and say, they're hear your concerns, but I actually think this is a good project. I think this is good for the community. And so it gave them space to provide us feedback on improving the project. It gave them the confidence to go before the city council when it went up for a zoning vote. So I think that in cases where you know ahead of time, or even maybe if you've had a single meeting, and there's been sort of a contentious atmosphere, that use of a facilitator to create a safe space and let everyone's opinions be heard is really, really valuable. I even had side meetings with some of the opponents, and one of them, who were very nice, didn't like our project, but they were very nice, said to me, "You guys were very smart to hire a facilitator." They said, "I don't think you would have gotten anywhere had you not done that." So I think that's a real tool that we as developers could use more often in tricky projects or difficult projects. So.
Do you mind if I pick up on this? Because this is free advertising for us, essentially. That's exactly what what we do. And we've heard that from developers across our region and in southern Maine that it is so helpful to have that third party facilitation. We are continually kind of honing our skills for community engagement. It's a little bit of an art, a little bit of a science. And it's never perfect, but there are best practices and better ways to go about community engagement. So bringing in somebody who has deep expertise in that is really a great first step, and it takes you out of the line of fire in some situations. Not that it exempts developers entirely within, those community meetings, but it definitely helps in those instances. So I would just echo those that advice from Brooks.
Thanks, Emmy. That was a good plug. And I will say that Michaela and I did attend the Kittery charrette, and the services that you all provided were excellent. So it was a really enjoyable experience for us as well, with you guys facilitating. We have one more question. It's going to be quick. We're approaching 6:30, or it is 6:30, and I'd like to honor some of the attendees who have been here throughout the entire workshop, so that you have a chance to ask questions. But our last question, we're seeking a one-sentence answer, if possible. Obviously, we'll go 1 to 3 sentences. And it is, what is one piece of advice you'd like to give municipalities to address the housing crisis in the region? It's a pretty broad question, but anything that initially comes to mind would be great. And we'll start with Emmy.
One sentence. Okay. Make your public meetings as accessible as possible by way of virtual options for attendance, and scheduling at times that are most conducive for working families. I'm trying to figure out how to put a period on this, but yes, that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Make your meetings accessible and multiple if possible.
That's really great advice. Patrick?
I like this challenge. I would say, building off a point I made earlier, seek alignment among staff and key municipal stakeholders in advance as much as possible, including absent a specific proposal, and think creatively about ways that municipality might use the tools at their disposal.
Another good one. Julie?
Yes, I would say ditto to what Patrick and Emmy said, and then I would just add be collaborative and creative. I think if put out there to developers what you would expect from the development community, so consistency, communication, a sense of urgency, all those things. Just rolling sleeves up and working together. I think when you invest in your town, developers will follow. We talked about that with infrastructure too. So I just want to thank you all for listening. It's been really really fun to be on the panel with everyone here, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you. And Brooks, your one sentence.
I would say work with groups like SMPDC to really look at your comp plans and your zoning ordinances to get them in a place that if you want housing and if you want to expand housing, that projects can be done by right.
Thanks, Brooks. I think Michaela is going to kick us off with Q&A now.
Great. Thank you all. That has been really helpful and interesting to listen to. I'm excited to see what questions attendees have. We have 2 in the chat, so we'll start with those. And attendees, if you want to request to speak your question, just raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute you and invite you to speak it out loud. So the first question we have is, are there particular state or federal policy changes that you are watching and are either excited for or wary of?
Feel free to jump in, guys.
I can start. I will say at the state level, there are many proposed bills this session that relate positively to housing development and funding, and I um, am kind of swimming in many of them, and so I would probably be remiss to try and call out just one. So I would say just keep an eye on many of them. At the federal level, something that we're certainly concerned about in the housing world, affordable housing world, is potential cuts to HUD and related programs that we rely on, whether it's tenant vouchers, CDBG, Housing Trust Fund. Um, but I don't want to dwell on those. I would say on the positive side, there's been a re-raising of, I think it's at different times it's been called different things, but it's a proposal that's come up in a bipartisan manner in a number of previous congressional sessions and has been recently re-proposed at both the House and Senate side, and essentially is an act to improve the LIHTC program that we've talked about, which is the primary financing tool from the federal government to develop affordable housing around the country. And it would enrich the program by providing more credits to the states, and it would change some of the mechanics around how it works that I think would unlock additional housing, including in rural areas, which I know is a topic we might get to next. And so that I think should be going through committee soon, and we're cautiously optimistic that amidst all of the uncertainty that's currently afloat at the federal level, that this might be a positive that could come out of this current congressional session.
Thanks, Patrick. One thing I've seen during this legislative session in Maine that I might ask specifically what you all think about is there's talk about prohibiting planning board review for 4 or fewer residential units in one structure. So basically staff review would be allowed, otherwise it would be treated the same as a single family home would be treated. So I'm curious if you think that would have an impact on providing some naturally occurring affordable or moderate income housing, and if so, what kind of impact you think that might have?
I think Avesta doesn't often work at that scale of 4 units and fewer, but I would think that anything we can do to speed up the planning board process and clear up their docket to focus on bigger, more complex projects and allow the competent professional municipal staff to handle more routine matters would be beneficial for all involved.
I just add to that. I agree with everything Patrick said. I would just add that that scale of development, it's not something that we sort of do either, but I know that we work with clients that do, and I think those are the scale developments on smaller lot sizes maybe, or sort of people have really good intent to have that sort of work, and they don't have the resources to invest in potentially like the design team it takes to get through the planning board process. And so I think nor do they have the time to do that. So I think that's from that perspective, which I know is probably not the perspective to angle, but I would say that from that perspective, I think it's a really positive thing because it can help, in a small way to extrapolate some more, small sized multifamily units amongst the development community that potentially isn't as sort of deep in the trenches of large scale development projects.
Great, thanks all. Does anyone, Brooks or Emmy, want to add anything to that question, or shall we move to the next one?
No, I think they covered it really well.
Well, I'm in New Hampshire land, so
True.
I'm focused on some different state policy, but I can lend a little bit of perspective as to what's happening here. We're definitely a little behind on the state level, but there were more housing bills in introduced in this session than ever before. And some of them were bills that, wouldn't stand a chance a few years ago. So we're really seeing some progress there. Also, I guess I'll start with the bad news is we're also updating the budget and it's pretty bleak right now. We have pretty low revenues, tax revenues, here in New Hampshire. And so there's inevitably going to be huge budget cuts in the state budget. Um, Coming up here. And so what's sort of on the chopping block right now is affordable housing funding, and what's called our Housing Champions program, which supports the municipalities in New Hampshire to really look at their zoning policies at the local level and provides them with the technical support they need to update those regulatory policies. And so we are fighting really hard to try to make sure that that funding is retained in that budget. But it's an uphill battle. Um, the good news is some of the zoning reforms, as I mentioned, are chugging along really well. In the absence of funding, we're kind of all collectively recognizing that there are things you can do on the zoning and land use side of things that don't require any funding. And that one of the bills I'm really excited about will allow for multifamily development in areas zoned for retail and office space. So there are a lot of, strip malls and underutilized office spaces throughout the region that could potentially be turned into housing, if this bill were to pass. So there is some good news in New Hampshire, but we'll see where the chips fall this year. So
Thank you, and thanks, Emmy, for providing that New Hampshire perspective. I think it's also really important for especially the JLUS project. As you all know, SMPDC does include a large portion of our region. It consists of rural communities, in addition to the larger, more coastal communities. So a question online is, what barriers have you seen in rural communities specifically? And how did you end up working working with that community in a rural setting? And I think rural is pretty open-ended. Doesn't mean 200 people. There are larger rural communities as well that aren't what we consider cities here in Maine.
I can jump in on that. Maybe I think one of the barrier, or not a barrier, but a challenge is, and I think Patrick had mentioned this earlier, is around infrastructure. And so to get scale, sewer is a big one, as are the others. But sort of what infrastructure does it exists in municipalities. When we're talking about sort of how we scale developments, that is something that's at least in my opinion, heavily assessed in terms of feasibility to serve the project. And so I think that can be sort of a challenge in a more rural community. And I say challenge, so we're dealing with this in a rural community. It just makes you think differently about how you design the space. So really we're looking at smaller, more, smaller units separated. And so they're not 12 units or 6 units or whatever the mix ends up being. So sort of it makes you think more creatively and work a bit harder to sort of figure that critical sort of the science piece out. But that's something I've sort of actively been working on.
I'd add a couple of sort of observations. One is that in the sort of tax credit, affordable housing world, it can be difficult to develop in the more rural areas of at least Maine because the rents are lower. So, sorry. So HUD sets rent limits for various areas in Maine. Because the rents are lower in outlying communities, you can take on less debt from the income that you're generating from the rents. So it means that you have to find more gap financing. So rural communities, there are programs that are available only to rural communities. And in some cases, organizations like Maine Housing give higher subsidy amounts to projects in rural areas. But I'd say that's, one thing to really to focus on is how can you support a project as a municipality in helping that developer, that project, that nonprofit, whomever, for-profit developer find more of that gap financing on the public side and be applying for it to help fill those gaps. Because what you see is construction prices have skyrocketed and they're pretty flat across the state. So it's not like you're going to see a huge reduction in construction costs just because you're outside of Portland per se. Interest rates are across the board, but because of those lower rents, it's more difficult. There was one other thing, and now I'm blanking on it. So I'll come back to it if I remember it.
I would agree with all of that. And one item I would add, and this might be what you're thinking of, Brooks, I'm not sure, is a challenge that we've seen in proposing new developments in rural communities is a lower level of familiarity with the type of housing that we're providing. And so working in communities along the seacoast, up through Portland and in some other larger municipalities across the state, there's a general familiarity with apartment buildings, and many residents of these communities either have lived in apartments themselves or know others that do. And in rural communities where this housing type of multifamily development isn't as common, there sometimes is a necessary conversation to remove, outdated stigmas about what is this housing and who are the people that are going to be living in this housing and what does it mean for the people living in this housing to be so close together when the predominant, housing type in the area is single family homes that might be, spread farther apart from each other. And so that's a matter of education and engagement. And in the communities where we've been successful in overcoming the challenges that Brooks mentioned, we have also found that the neighborhood meetings like we were talking about earlier and the opportunity to describe who we are and what we do and what the type of housing we're providing is and who our residents will be in public meetings and in other neighborhood engagements has been really, really critical.
And I'll just quickly add to that, rural communities, often folks move to them for its, rural character. And so altering the built environment in any way is that much more challenging. And on the other side of the coin that Patrick just referenced, there's not a ton of familiarity and knowledge of gentle density in those areas. In some rural communities, 4 units could make a enormous difference in a community. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean colossal giant apartment buildings all of the time. And so it's yeah, like Patrick was saying, the public education component is a big barrier, and that's something that we're also working to address through our community engagement programs and just ongoing conversations with communities.
Yeah, one other thing I wanted to add. Maine Housing really recently had a couple rounds of a rural rental program, and if you can look it up online in Madison, Maine, they did. I'm not sure how many of them there were, but there are several buildings that they did that are modular, and so that seems to be an avenue that people are looking at. We recently did a modular building in South Portland, sort of as a test case or a pilot to see how it went. But that's definitely an avenue, I think, in rural areas and even in urban areas that we should be continuing to try to expand and support, because I think it in the right case it can add it can reduce time for construction, it can reduce costs. And so the project in Madison, they did have some, public funding, but I believe that by using the modular construction type, it really reduced their cost and made it feasible. And those buildings are kind of like Emmy said, they're 4 to 8 unit buildings. They're not 40 unit buildings.
Thanks, guys. Those are all really great examples, and I'm glad that the question was asked from the attendees. So thanks for that. We do have one final question. It's a really good one, so I'm gonna go for it. In addition to lifting restrictions on development, have you come across many communities that are requiring density in their downtowns, such as minimum density or height requirements, not allowing single-family homes downtown, or waiving application fees for affordable housing projects? How much more attractive would a community be to housing developers with these changes? Thanks, Aaron.
I can't think of a community off the top of my head, honestly. But I did work in California for 4 years on housing issues, and that is definitely more common out there. But I always thought that, I was living in the future a little bit out there. So, but I can't think of any New England or Seacoast communities off the top of my head, or even Maine communities.
I would also agree that I'm not familiar with any communities that have set height requirements. I don't know that we get into form-based zoning here. It's a topic I know very little bit about. Um, I would say, as I mentioned earlier, that the city of Portland has provided for decreased fees for projects that meet certain affordability requirements for both planning board applications and building permits. That can go a long way, not only in a practical sense of lowering the total development cost for a proposal, but sending a signal that the community is interested in seeing more affordable housing. And so I think there's two aspects to making adjustments to fees. One is the practical sense, and two is just the message it sends about, hey, we're interested in this, we're aligned on this, and that we are putting a tool that we have control over at the disposal of developers who are interested in providing the affordable housing. And it's, I think important for both reasons, both practical and in messaging.
I haven't run into that situation either. I do know in the town of Scarborough, Maine, they in the last several years decreased the allowable. So in their village center zoning, they decreased the allowable maximum footprint, but at the same time, sorry, per building. So they went down to, I think it's like 10,000 square feet footprint is the max you can do. But conversely, they increased the height, allowable height. And so it was a very conscious decision that we want buildings with smaller footprints, but more height. And to answer the person's questions, yeah, I would say absolutely. If a community that you're describing would be very, a place you'd want to do a project, a place you'd want to work with.
Yeah, I'll just echo everyone's comments. I think it goes back to something I said earlier. Sort of go where you're celebrated. If there's little notes of that in the way the zoning's written, or sort of in policies that the municipality has, it shines through. I would just say that the there's a couple municipalities I've worked with that in their village center, and I mentioned earlier that's sort of where we focus. There's sort of just a negotiation around what the height of your building's going to be, and we all sort of look at it in context and make the decision together on what that looks like, because obviously it has to work for us and it has to work for fitting into the downtown. So yeah, I haven't seen that before. It's an interesting concept, but I think just echoing everyone's sentiments, it seems like that's the that would be a welcoming place for a developer to be. One last thing about fees. I think that if we're, it's a simple concept, but affordable housing, restaurants, you name it, if that's what you want in your municipalities, it's prudent not to sort of have the fees hit them hard, or find a way to sort of to get the fees that you need through more creative way. Like I said earlier, can it be later in the process once the restaurant's up and running, or I've seen a lot in restaurants, which is why I'm mentioning it. But those are sort of creative solutions, because the funds still need to be collected, but is there a timing sort of alteration that can be made to be more accommodating for these, I'm talking about businesses, but also businesses, housing, you name it.
And I'll just add,
Great.
sorry, one more thing. My mind immediately went to height requirements, and because that the concept of that I think is still um, very rarely seen here in New England. But I do know of a few examples of municipalities that have eliminated or reduced developer impact fees. I believe the city of Dover did that last year, reduced them to zero. And we've seen some really great movement in Dover in general on that. But there's also a statewide incentive here in New Hampshire called RSA 79E, which allows for property tax relief of up to 9 years to developers who affordable housing. So there are statewide incentives in place here in New Hampshire.
Great. Well, I'm going to wrap us up. I want to give a huge thank you to our panelists for being here with us tonight. I certainly learned a lot, and really appreciate your insight, and I'm really glad you could join us in doing this webinar. We're putting up their contact info on the screen, so if you're participating and want to reach out, they've all agreed to share their emails. So thank you all, Emmy, Brooks, Patrick, and Julie, for being here. Also want to thank Malia for running the slides and the Q&A and helping us with that. And want to plug that if you're looking for more housing resources, besides through this JLUIS effort, in which we'll be producing the housing toolkit with different municipal examples. We will also be working on some municipal ordinance audits in housing opportunity program grant. So if your municipality might be interested in that, reach out to SMPDC. We'll also be providing an illustrated guide about different housing typologies and how they can fit into existing Maine neighborhoods. So if you're interested in that, keep a lookout for it over the next year or so at the end of 2026. But lots of good housing stuff coming out of SMPDC and through the JLUIS effort. And we are really grateful for everyone for attending tonight. So with that, good night. Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.
Too.